few. I think a lot of my most memorable ones have been interviewing my own relatives. And so my cousin, for example, is a basket maker. And things that I thought I knew about not only her life, but also some of her experiences were kind of overturned because she had these different revelations, different kind of unexpected things to share about her process of basket making and even the role of her mom in the basket making process. So yeah, I think those have been the most interesting to me. I started an oral history project with my own family, and just interviewing aunts and uncles has been pretty amazing.
One of the people that I interviewed was recalling a traumatic event, and I went into social work mode and started asking her therapeutic questions like, how did you feel about that? You know, like, can you tell me more about that experience? Like, and it was like, you know, everything they taught you, teach you in school just went out the door. I was like panicking, and I'm like, oh no, I shouldn't have asked that. You know, as she's, you know, kind of like at this point, she's, you know, emotionally triggered and, you know, starting to like just, you know, kind of, I could see the body language and all of that, and she was sort of retreating into herself, and I was just like, okay, reframe. That was probably my most memorable interview, because I just really dropped the ball, and I remember thinking to myself, oh God, I cannot do that again, like I cannot, you know, and she, the person I was interviewing, you know, wanted, stopped, you know, we had to stop for a bit midway, and then I took that opportunity to kind of check in with her, like if there's anything she needed, does she need support? She came with somebody, so, you know, does she want to check in with them? And it was fine. Really, you know, it was a big learning experience for me, for sure.
I think my most memorable interview experience happened in a research circle, and it really was a moment of realizing that someone was sharing a story that they'd never shared before, and just experiencing really deep humility that that they had decided, that this grandmother had decided to share something that she carried for a long time. So it always stayed with me, just this possibility of what you're asking for, and you don't always know what you're going to receive, and how that moment felt really, really sacred and really powerful, and reminded me of the importance of just sitting still and listening. So
I was working with, in community, and I was working with an artist, and we were talking about knowledge sharing, knowledge transmission, translation, all of these sorts of really interesting ideas. And so we had a really good conversation in the morning for about an hour, and a deep connection, but there was still something kind of that wasn't crystallizing for me, and I think things that he was trying to communicate that wasn't really happening in the interview. So he invited me in the afternoon to come to his studio, and he was working on pole carving. And so we spent the afternoon, I was witnessing what he was doing, and he asked me to participate in some of the carving. The experience was really quite impactful. And so it was just the thinking and the doing that really enhanced the whole understanding of knowledge sharing.
I think one of the lessons that I've really learned is that, especially with our relationships that we have with our communities and our elders and people who really love and care about us, is that sometimes we forget to recognize that the time and the energy they're giving in our capitalist world doesn't come for free. And so we need to be able to really think very carefully about how do we reciprocate their times and their energies in meaningful ways. You know, I was reminded when I went home and I was doing some research that the aunties who were supporting me in the research that I was doing took really important time off their own labor as market women who work and sell to raise an income for their families, for the time that they took away, that meant that they lost that income that was very critical to supporting their families and the needs of their families. So we have to really think about those kinds of things, right? Like how, if we're applying for funding, how do we incorporate in those proposals ways to remunerate or to honor and to respect the fact that folks really are giving up a significant amount of resources and time, so nobody went to the market from the time you were away, and I hadn't budgeted for that adequately in the proposal. So that was a big hard lesson. I learned the hard way.
That my most memorable experience interviewing folks is when I realized that in order for people to feel comfortable in an interview, it really has to be a conversation. And so it's important for the person to feel like you're giving something to them when you're asking something of them. And so the way that I was taught, in grad school was to interview someone like, Barbara Walters would, right? Ask them questions, they just give you back the answers, and that notion of objectivity. But when I realized that it was actually important for me to share as much as I was asking of others, that I was going to actually get more information, but also more authentic information, because I developed some level of trust with those people. That was a really big learning for me.
I don't know if I can pinpoint one memorable experience. I think all of the people that I've ever interviewed have been incredible. Because I think with research and with the kind of work that I've done, I'm really going in depth into people's life stories often. And everyone's story is so unique and different. And I find that process, that first sort of initial conversation that starts and then it moves in a matter of an hour so deeply into people's lives is really powerful. And it's probably why I've loved doing research so much. But I know that probably the one that I was the most nervous about was when I was doing my master's research. And some of the first few interviews that I did there, I was really anxious. But again, my participants were so incredibly generous.
Okay, so my most memorable interview experience is, I'd have to say, my first interview that I did for my PhD research. And the reason it was so memorable is because, well, this was my PhD project, so it was really exciting. And I was interviewing people who were a part of an Indigenous community in downtown Toronto. So I was a part of this community. So the first person I interviewed was actually a really close friend of mine. And so it was memorable in the sense that we probably laughed the entire time because it was kind of awkward. Like, we were friends, but I was interviewing her on topics that we wouldn't normally talk about. So we laughed a lot, and it was kind of awkward. But at the same time, I probably got absolutely no information out of that interview. If you're a part of that community and going in to ask questions, I felt as though my first interview, they didn't want to get into details because they're like, oh, Renee, you already know. Like, you already know about this. Why do I have to go into detail? So I found that it was really hard getting answers out. I wanted to be like, pretend I didn't know anything about it, but it's almost impossible. So that was probably my most memorable one, and a huge learning curve because I had to realize that I had to kind of adjust the way I was asking questions in order to actually get information. But yeah, definitely that first one. It was awkward in my PhD because I had no idea what I was doing. But and the thing is, you can read so much about interviews and prepare and do mock interviews, but it's not until you actually get in and do it is when you actually learn what you're, like, how to do things. But
I think one of the most common mistakes that I've seen in graduate students is that they don't prepare. They think that that an interview is like a conversation, and while it has to be conversational, you also have to have had some experience, and that's just practice, in actually talking to people and guiding a conversation in a certain way. So you have to think about how a question is worded. What is the sequence of questions? Like, how likely is someone going to be to answer something in a deep, sort of full way when it's very specific, like right off the bat, rather than something more general that gives them a chance to think about it a little bit and then to start to drill down a little bit more deeply into that.
One is not knowing more about who you're interviewing, so not doing kind of your research on your end, and so in a sense not getting the most out of that conversation.
I think a common, maybe not mistake, but misconception is you think you're going in and you've developed these questions, you're sort of set apart from them. You think, oh, these aren't difficult questions or whatever. But you never know with your participants what will be sensitive for them. Because you can ask something simply of like, where do you live? And then you're talking to a 60 scoop survivor. They're like, well, I was apprehended. Or I don't know my family, so something simple as where do you live can be, so you have to really know who you're interviewing.
There are times where interviewers are pressing for a particular response, so they want, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconsciously, they want the interviewee to respond in a certain way. And so that kind of narrowing of the options, or that kind of narrowing of the conversation, can sometimes constrain the actual results, but it can also, in a sense, disrupt the overall flow of the conversation. But also be aware if you are kind of guiding the responses, right? If you allow the interviewee to come to that on their own, it's going to be a much richer interview, and it's going to be a much richer, kind of response overall.
I'm not sure of what other people have made, but I've made has been around that I've been so excited about particular inquiry and particular research that I think is really important, and so I will come with my own agenda of saying we need to go in this particular direction. And so sometimes we have to take a step back, and that it's okay for us to come with questions, but it's also okay for the community to redirect us. And so I think we have to come in with a certain amount of sensitivity that, yes, these are the things I'm excited about, and then to be also ready to put those things down and to go with what is the community wanting. So I think the mistake I've come in sometimes is I've come holding too tightly to my own research agenda, that I've sometimes missed the opportunity of engaging in more broader, bigger questions that are more salient and relevant to the community. The point I'm making is that we need to be ready to be of service, and that might not be reflective of the things that we think are important at the time.
So, sometimes I remember I would start off my interviews and be really formal, and it was mostly because I was nervous. And so I wanted to do a good job, right? And so I'd adhere to this kind of structure of my questions. But I think one of the things that is really important is just being yourself and being open to working with a participant and giving them the space to speak. So don't interrupt them, don't finish off their conversation or their sentence, and be really open to listening. So active listening, meaning you're engaging, asking them more questions and sitting back and listening.
I would say I think that nervousness can sometimes take over and prevent, for at least in my own experience, really make it harder to just be present and listen. I think it's a real practice to be in the interview experience and to listen to hear rather than listen to respond. And I think the idea of being a researcher or knowledge gatherer can come with lots of feelings about what we're supposed to do or how we're supposed to do it. And really when we are inviting someone to share their knowledge, we want to be present as much as possible to listen. And whether they've agreed to be recorded or whether we're listening to document or take notes, it's really to try our best to be present. Because you don't just hear with your your ears, you're hearing with your heart and your spirit and your body. I think that would be important.
This is coming from my own experience, is not actually listening. And what I find is that, and I had to learn this at the beginning of me doing interviews as well, is that you state the question and the person is talking, but I find that I'm already thinking about the next question and I'm already thinking about, okay, where is this going to go, opposed to just sitting back and taking in the information.
Mistake that I made was not testing my equipment beforehand. One of the first interviews I did for my PhD research, I lost almost the entire data, or the entire conversation, because my recorder did something funky in the middle of it, and I had no idea. So now I often will have two recording devices on at the same time, so that if one messes up, I have the other one to turn to.
So having a good understanding of what your goal is coming out of that interview, and having realistic goals.
Sitting with and really thinking about what were your hopes and intentions for doing this research, and what are you hoping to get out of it.
How important it is to build a relationship with the person that you're talking to. I've noticed is regardless of who's doing the interview, how much you know the person, it's an awkward relationship at the beginning. It can be really be really stressful for the person who is behind, the conversation and who you is the center of that. And so I think it's really important to center some sense of relationship with the person, giving them some space to feel at ease to ask you questions as well as you asking them questions.
Be prepared in terms of really knowing your research and the questions. And oftentimes the questions and answers won't be in a linear format, so doing some background information, so maybe about the community or about their occupation or their job, if you know anything unique about them, so that you can really kind of set each other at ease when you're meeting and talking.
Indigenous research in particular will tell you that relationship is absolutely required. When you're asking someone to divulge information about themselves or their perspective on the world, a good interview, a good guided conversation comes from having contact with that person outside of that interview before it happens, and ideally after, but particularly before. The person isn't going to trust you if they don't know anything about you, so I would suggest spend time with the people that you're going to ask that of before the interview or discussion groups or circles or whatever you're having occurs. And that's doing things that don't really relate to the interview itself, right? So that could be lunch, it could be a walk, it could be making something together. Usually it's something that person has some power over in terms of the decision about what you're going to do.
Starting the conversation with things that are relatable as humans, talking about, I find talking about family often helps, things that are really important to them. Sometimes I'll start a conversation by saying, you know, how would other people describe you? And people do turn to the really strength-based pieces that they see in themselves, or that they know other people see in them. And that sometimes brings out laughter in the very beginning and eases the process a little bit before going into really in-depth, you know, stories and stuff that can be quite painful to talk about.
Yeah, and I think have fun with it. You know, it's often, it can be a time to, you know, inject humor. It can be a time to kind of provide your own personal anecdotes at times if it's appropriate, so that it puts the interviewee at ease.
Like, don't be afraid to joke around. You know, like, break the ice, like, you know, comment about, I don't know, the weather, or, you know, like, we like to joke around. We like to use humor. Not everybody is humorous, but, you know, it really breaks the ice. Joke around, have fun, you know, with your participant.
I think at least build in time for follow-ups, so that person can review the transcripts if you're transcribing, so that they can have enough time to make sure that their words are what they intended, if you're going to publish it or if you're going to put it in a document of some sort.
Summarizing the information. So after you've asked a question, or at the end of the interview, you might want to go back and summarize that with a participant, just to make sure that you're both in sync and that you're interpreting the same thing.
You know, following kind of basic protocols, especially if you're working with Indigenous peoples, of bringing a gift, so that you, and a gift that's meaningful, you know, that's homemade. You know, I usually bring tea, for example, or something like that that's useful or might be, you know, related to the topic that we're talking about. But that gift also helps ease any tension, because there will be tension when you put for example, a consent form in front of someone.
For example, if you're bringing an honorarium, also bring along maybe a small personal gift. And what I've done in the past is I made homemade jam and brought little jars, or even bringing along dried herbal tea. And I found that it just kind of showed an extra level of respect to the person you're interviewing, and just kind of help build that relationship and showing that you're not just kind of using them for research, but more so you want to get to know them.
So what is that practice that we have to prepare to go and sit with someone that helps us come with our good thoughts and our good feelings? And that doesn't mean we have to pretend nothing's happening in our lives, but what helps us to just prepare ourselves, like to come in really, in a way, sit in ceremony with someone. Whatever that practice is, it can look really different for everyone. I think is super important, and likewise the practice of coming out of the interview, because sometimes we hear stories that maybe right away we understand have changed something inside of us or impacted us, and maybe afterwards we realize the impact of what we witnessed. And so having a process of taking care, which again could be like being out on the land, smudging, journaling, you know, processing with someone that you love or trust, or who you've engaged to support you in the research process.
So a key suggestion that I would give to students about interviewing people is making sure that you let that participant know that you're going to. Let them know that they're the expert, and you're going to them for information that you don't know yet. So ensuring that you show them respect.
Always bring your dog. No.